January 17, 1943, night over the Gulf. Clouds hang like wet wool. Moonlight cuts a cold seam across black water. A twin-engine reconnaissance plane hums low, skirting weather, its pilot counting seconds between lightning and horizon. He has flown farther west than he intended. Wind has teeth tonight. Instruments twitch. The coast is a rumor, until a beadwork of lights appears scattered and fragile, like a necklace dropped on velvet. Then the radio crackles with English. A searchlight spears the clouds. Another finds him. He banks, too late. A pair of American trainers, silver gulls with claws, sweep in from his blind side. Warning bursts arc past the nose. The left engine coughs and flares. Heat floods the cockpit. He smells scorched paint. He cuts fuel, feathers the prop, and feels the aircraft sag. Alarms bleat in a language no one can misunderstand. Below, salt flats. Marsh. A small Texas town ringed with derricks and wind-leaning pines. He wrestles the yoke, trims for glide, and when the second engine surges then dies, he chooses the only path left: open the canopy, face the wind, and trust silk and gravity. The parachute blooms. The earth rises, and an American winter breathes in. By the winter of 1943, the war was everywhere, even in places where it technically wasn't. The coasts of the United States had become edges of paranoia. German U-boats had prowled the Atlantic like wolves. Rumors spread of saboteurs landing in Florida, of coded signals flashing from lonely lighthouses. Texas, with its shipyards, oil depots, and training fields, was considered safely inland, but fear drifted even here like dust. At the edge of that fear stood a small coastal town called Clearwater Bend, home to barely 2,000 souls. It was a place of salt-bitten porches, cotton gins, and single-engine crop dusters that flew lower than the church steeple. Its lifeline was an oil-loading rail spur that fed tankers bound for the Gulf, and like most towns of its size, it had no hospital, only a 2-room clinic operated by Dr. Nathaniel Ross, a man in his 50s whose hands trembled from fatigue more than age. He had delivered half the town's babies and buried nearly as many of them. The nearest hospital lay 40 miles inland, reachable only by a dirt road that turned to mud whenever rain came, and rain always came. In those seasons, accidents in the oil fields or the mills often turned fatal, not from severity, but from delay. That January, the war came to Clearwater Bend on a cold wind. The airbase 30 miles south at Port Clarion was a training facility, newly built, hastily staffed, and often more chaos than command. American pilots there flew old P-36 Hawks and fresh-painted P-40s on long, monotonous patrols meant to keep their reflexes alive. They joked that nothing ever happened on their watch, until the night of January 17, 1943. Radar was primitive. A single operator caught the blip, an aircraft crossing from the Gulf, no flight plan, no signal. The order was simple: intercept. By the time the 2 American trainers spotted the stranger's silhouette over the waves, the storm had already done half their work. When the German pilot's parachute opened, the townsfolk were still finishing supper. Some thought it was a weather balloon. Others swore the devil had fallen from the sky. Sheriff Luke Crawford drove out with 2 deputies and a borrowed army jeep. They found the pilot half-conscious in the salt grass, a torn harness trailing like a flag behind him. He gave his name softly, in accented English: Lieutenant Karl Heinemann, Luftwaffe reconnaissance. 26 years old, no weapon. A map soaked beyond recognition. They took him into custody and called the base. Within days, he was moved to Camp Clarion, a temporary POW facility surrounded by barbed wire and boredom. For the military, he was just another prisoner in a war that stretched far beyond imagination. For Clearwater Bend, he was a curiosity, a story whispered through cafe windows and church pews. But the war had a strange way of bending lines between enemies. As more captured Germans were shipped inland to Texas, to pick cotton, repair fences, or lay rail lines, towns began to see them less as monsters and more as men displaced by history. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were allowed to work, earn small wages, and even write letters home. By mid-1943, Texas held more than 50,000 Axis prisoners. Camp Clarion was one of the smallest, but it shared the same rhythm: reveille, roll call, work detail, supper, silence. Karl was assigned to the maintenance shed, repairing broken engines for farm trucks and generators. His quiet competence drew attention. Word spread that he had once studied mechanical engineering in Hamburg before the draft pulled him into the Luftwaffe. It was Dr. Ross who first noticed him outside the fence, not as a soldier, but as a worker repairing a generator for the town's canning warehouse. The doctor's own generator had failed weeks ago, leaving his clinic without proper lighting. The local mechanic refused to touch it. Parts were scarce, and war rations meant waiting months for replacements. Ross petitioned the camp commander for help. The reply came with hesitation, but not refusal. Under supervision, Heinemann was permitted to assist. That was how it began, a German airman fixing a Texan doctor's light. But in that faint flicker of electricity, something more took root. The town was struggling. Influenza had returned. Births outnumbered beds, and the doctor's clinic, once the pride of the county, now looked like a relic from another century. The pastor suggested prayer. The sheriff suggested patience. But both men knew faith and time wouldn't build walls or sterilize instruments. The German pilot, quiet and observant, saw things differently. He saw inefficiency, wasted space, and opportunity in scrap metal and abandoned barns. He didn't speak much, but when he did, he sketched on the back of ration forms, ventilation systems, water pumps, proper drainage lines. The doctor listened. The townsfolk didn't know what to make of it, and slowly, under that uneasy partnership, the idea was born. A proper hospital, built not by decree or funding, but by the hands of soldiers and civilians who, by all logic, should have hated each other. The winter storms were only the beginning. By March 1943, Lieutenant Karl Heinemann had become an unusual fixture in Clearwater Bend, half prisoner, half craftsman. The camp commander, Major Samuel Greer, was a pragmatic man. Idle hands make trouble, he often said, but working ones keep peace. Under his watch, small groups of POWs were allowed to assist local labor crews, guarded loosely by men with rifles who rarely raised them. The townspeople's fear softened with familiarity. They saw the prisoners singing while digging ditches, fixing machinery, or stacking lumber. Their English was clumsy, their laughter cautious. But they were not the monsters propaganda had promised. They were farm boys, engineers, and fathers, lost in a war they no longer believed in. Karl, quiet and meticulous, quickly became the bridge between both worlds. He repaired the church bell motor, restored a tractor that had been rusting behind the grain mill, and even taught the sheriff's nephew to fix a carburetor. The guards trusted him, the townsfolk tolerated him, and Dr. Ross, exhausted, overworked, and burdened by a town's ailments, began to depend on him. Ross's clinic was collapsing under weight it could no longer bear. The building's walls were warped from humidity. The floorboards smelled faintly of iodine and rot. 2 beds served the entire county. Mothers waited on benches with sick children while miners from the oil rigs leaned against the walls, coughing black dust. The doctor had improvised everything he could, disinfectant from vinegar, splints from broom handles, but the war's rationing left shelves bare. The Red Cross shipped medical supplies to the front. The Army hospitals inland got priority. Small towns like Clearwater Bend were left to pray and patch. And yet, through the fatigue and shortages, Dr. Ross carried on, until one night in April when he lost a patient. A young boy, 12, crushed under a fuel drum at the refinery. He could have lived, if they'd had proper equipment, if they'd had blood for transfusion, if the lights hadn't flickered out mid-operation. But if didn't save anyone. That night, the doctor sat on the clinic steps under the cold porch bulb, head in his hands. And Karl, passing by with a guard after a generator repair, paused. He said nothing at first. Then in careful English, almost like reciting from a manual, "Where I trained, we learned efficiency first, emotion later. But here you work with neither tools nor rest. That is waste." Ross looked up, weary. "Waste?" Karl nodded. "Of your skill." That conversation, brief, awkward, human, but would become the seed of something larger. Within weeks, the doctor and the pilot began sketching. They started with simple ideas: better ventilation for surgeries, storage for clean linens, proper drainage. Then it grew, an entire floor plan, a real hospital, small but efficient, built from surplus materials and ingenuity. Major Greer was skeptical. The county council laughed. Funds were non-existent, labor scarce, and lumber rationed. But the pastor of the local church, Reverend Miles, saw providence in the plan. He rallied parishioners. The sheriff offered to coordinate work details. And the women's circle, tired of funerals and fevers, began organizing bake sales and collections to buy nails, windows, and paint. A committee formed, informal but determined. And in the center of it stood two unlikely men, a weary American doctor and a captured German engineer. The war continued elsewhere, in Tunisia, in the skies over Europe, in the Pacific jungles. But here, in this forgotten patch of Texas, a quieter battle unfolded, one against disease, indifference, and despair. The town couldn't stop the war, but perhaps it could outlast it by building something that saved rather than destroyed. By May, the outlines were visible. The site chosen, an unused shipping warehouse by the rail line. The prisoners cleared debris, hammered beams, and poured concrete under watchful eyes. Karl directed without commanding, his instructions translated through a camp interpreter. His diagrams, drawn on ration paper, were pinned to the warehouse wall beside a crucifix. Children came to watch through the fence. Some called him the Flying German. He would smile politely, never breaking his posture of quiet discipline. He didn't talk about the war. He didn't talk about home. But once, when asked what he would do if peace came, he replied softly, "I would build something that lasts." The foundation was poured by midsummer. A miracle, some called it. A collaboration that shouldn't have existed. Others called it treason, helping the enemy, giving comfort to those who had bombed cities and sunk ships. Letters were written to the state authorities. Investigations were threatened, but by then Clearwater Bend had decided. The hospital was no longer about war or nationality. It was about survival. About mothers who needed care. About children who deserved life. About a town that refused to wait for permission to heal itself. The war outside the wire raged louder each month. Inside it, something else was being born, quietly, stubbornly, humanly. And by the time the summer heat baked the saltgrass gold, the skeleton of the hospital stood against the horizon, a promise made of wood, sweat, and improbable faith. Its walls were not yet finished. Its story was only beginning. Dr. Nathaniel Ross learned to measure time in heartbeats. He had a clock on the clinic wall. Yes, and a wristwatch that ran slow when the humidity rose. But his true measure was the space between a patient's inhale and the next. He could feel when a breath faltered before the chest knew it. He could hear fear hidden in a cough. Years of scarcity had taught him to read people like charts. To triage not just bodies, but hope. Karl Heinemann measured time differently. He heard it in the cadence of machines, the steady hum that announced efficiency, the stutter that prophesied failure. A field generator told him as much as a man's voice. A bent valve could sound like regret. When he stepped into Ross's clinic the first time, he stood very still and listened. The room spoke in code. Weak current, dirty air, leaks under the sink. Clutter masquerading as comfort. Their first true argument was about space. Ross wanted the operating table where the morning light fell. "Clean light," he said, "is a kind of mercy." Karl countered with airflow and a sketch of laminar paths cut from a medical manual he half remembered. "Light without air," he said, "invites infection." They went back and forth until both men realized they were arguing the same point from different languages. Ross in human outcomes, Karl in mechanical causes. They made a compromise that felt like a handshake. The table would move 6 feet. A vented hood would be built from tins and ducting. A window would be protected by a slatted shade to keep glare off instruments but let the morning honesty in. Outside, the town watched this unlikeliest pair, one man American by soil, the other German by sky, begin a daily ritual. Ross arrived before dawn, checked charts, wiped instruments twice, then once more for luck. Karl came under guard, nodded to the deputy, rolled up his sleeves, and laid out tools as if preparing a symphony. They did not speak often, but when they did, their words were precise. Pain tolerated precision. Precision, in turn, paid back pain with small victories. A fever that broke, a wound that closed cleanly, a birth that kept both mother and child. In time, the townsfolk noticed something else. The doctor's tremor lessened. Sleep found him more nights than not. He laughed, quietly, a small thing, but real, when a toddler stole his stethoscope and Karl returned it with a theatrical bow. The pilot did not ask for thanks. He accepted coffee he could not sweeten because sugar was rationed. He fixed a rattle in the clinic door so it would not wake patients in the night. He repaired a toy train left in the waiting room, then pretended with perfect seriousness that the engine required daily inspections. That was how trust arrived in Clearwater Bend, not in speeches, but in the even rhythm of two men matching each other's breath and hum. The hospital rose from the discipline of parts. No supply officer could conjure a sterilizer, yet one appeared, welded from a retired canning kettle, pressure gauged by salvaging the dial off a broken air compressor. Karl drafted the build with a carpenter's pencil on butcher paper, annotated in neat German that Ross learned to decipher: inlet, outlet, drain, purge. They mounted the kettle on a brick plinth, fed it with a gas line the sheriff's cousin scrounged from a mothballed pump, and tested it with empty glass bottles until the gauge held steady at a whisper past the safe mark. For the first time, the clinic smelled sharply, undeniably clean. Lighting next. The warehouse that would become the hospital had shipyard surplus bulbs that flickered like anxious eyes. Karl rerouted the circuits, isolating the surgical bay on its own loop, adding a knife switch with a porcelain handle that would hold steady through storms. A teenage radio hobbyist named Eli soldered connections as if they were church work, each bead a prayer against darkness. When they threw the switch and the operating lamp steadied into a pale, unwavering sun, Ross stood beneath it and closed his eyes. "We just subtracted a risk," he said. "We just subtracted night." Water was the quiet miracle. The town had wells, barrels, and an old gravity tank that sulked on a rotting tower. Karl sketched a closed-loop system that reclaimed gray water for cleaning floors and routed fresh water through a filter bed of sand and charcoal boxed in cypress. The carpenter who built coffins built the filter housing with the same care he gave to the dead. The first gallons ran cloudy. The 10th gleamed. Ross filled a pan, lifted it to the light, and saw no ghosts in it at all. They turned cast-offs into instruments. A dentist's foot pedal drill became a bone saw with a hand-turned gearbox. A cracked magnifying glass was nested into a wooden frame, becoming a field loop for stitches. Bed frames were welded from rail spikes and pipe, then planed smooth so the sheets would not snag. The hospital windows earned shutters made from crate slats scored with diagonal vents. When the Gulf wind ran through them, the rooms sighed like lungs finally clearing. None of it was elegant. All of it worked. And because the system was made in public, the town learned enough of its logic to maintain it. At Sunday suppers, you could hear arguments about flow rates and the virtues of brass over iron in humid air. A mother who had never turned a wrench could now diagnose a sputtering pump. A blacksmith who had never read a blueprint could tell you why angles matter where people bleed. In war, technology often means distance, radar horizons, bomb weights, velocity. Here, technology meant nearness. It meant a lamp that did not blink, a blade that did not rust, a wash basin that ran warm even when the rain beat the roof. It meant the difference between a child who lived and one who did not. Major Samuel Greer signed every permission slip with a pen that squeaked. He kept a ledger that would outlast him. Dates, names, work details, guard rotations, supply movements, complaints. He was not a sentimental man, but he respected systems because systems resisted panic. When the hospital plan crossed his desk in April, he wrote one word in the margin, conditional, and underlined it twice. He would authorize POW labor for civic works only if the town could prove oversight, and only if the Red Cross observer initialed the log. Sheriff Luke Crawford had a different ledger: favors owed, tempers measured, rumors tracked like weather. He convened meetings on the church steps because the breeze kept arguments cool. His rule was plain: fear could speak. It could not decide. When a handful of men called the project treason, he gave them 3 minutes each to be heard, and then asked a single question. If your wife was bleeding at midnight and the road to the county hospital was mud, would you refuse a light because a German wired the switch? Silence did most of the work after that. Reverend Miles walked between those ledgers with a Bible under one arm and lumber lists under the other. On Sunday he preached not forgiveness, which felt premature, but usefulness, which felt possible. Mercy, he said, is not soft. Mercy is disciplined help. We will be judged not by whom we hated in wartime, but by what we built while we waited. Parishioners started leaving nails in the collection plate. The church basement filled with bandages rolled during evening hymn practice. The moral line remained bright. No one forgot what uniform Karl had worn. Letters from families overseas told of submarines, bombed docks, sons missing at sea. The hospital did not erase that grief. It did not ask anyone to love an enemy. It asked them to accept a paradox. A man could be your enemy and your craftsman at the same time, and you could hold both truths without breaking. Greer enforced boundaries. Guards escorted POWs. Tools were counted. Work stopped at dusk. When a prisoner tried to slip a coded note through the fence, he was transferred inland the next day without ceremony. The sheriff did not argue. Karl did not intercede. Rules, they understood, were the structure that made mercy possible. Leadership in Clearwater Bend was not charisma. It was a steady hand on a hot day, a signature applied after the hard questions had been asked, a sermon that refused to trade pain for easy absolution. And under that kind of leadership, something rare occurred. The town's fear did not vanish. It simply became one voice among many, no longer the loudest. The ledgers grew heavier, the walls rose higher, and with each board hammered into place, the town redrew its idea of order, not as a fence against outsiders, but as a scaffold for the living. The scaffold would soon be tested. Night in Camp Clarion sounded like sawgrass and boots. After lights out, the barracks breathed in unison, cots creaking, a cough swallowed, the faint scritch of a pencil hoarding words for a letter that might never cross an ocean. In that pooled darkness, loyalties grew complicated. Some men, older, bone-tired, spoke of farms and bread. Others, young, clenched, kept to slogans because certainty warms better than blankets. Karl occupied a narrow bed beneath a window with a crooked latch. He was not the ranking man, but the men watched him, because he never raised his voice, because engines obeyed him, because the camp guards nodded when he approached a tool cart. Authority is noticed even when unclaimed, and it draws friction like static. Engineer, a prisoner muttered one evening, not quietly enough. You fix their town so they forget what they are doing to ours. Karl did not look up from the oil-stained notebook where he drew valves and ductwork. I build so someone will not die tomorrow. Not one of ours. Someone, Karl repeated, as if the word itself were a hinge he had chosen to grease. In another corner of the barracks, a former radio operator worried at a loose thread on his blanket and whispered about coded messages, about hiding a frequency in the static of the Friday night county broadcast. Two men listened, hungry for a purpose that felt like war. When they approached Karl for help, you understand circuits. You can make a tiny thing matter. He shook his head. A tiny thing already matters, he said. There is a child with a fever 3 blocks from the fence. That is the circuit I am repairing. He earned quiet enemies that night and quiet allies. The older men, the ones with farmer hands, slept easier. The younger ones stared harder at the ceiling. The camp interpreter, a school teacher before uniforms erased his chalkboard, told Karl in careful, teacherly German, "What you are doing will be judged by 2 nations and understood by none. Do it anyway." So he did, aware that usefulness can be a shield and a target, that the most dangerous thing in a barracks is not a contraband blade but an idea that asks men to measure. Victory in respirations instead of headlines. The hospital did not rise by diagrams alone. It rose on backs and casseroles, on gossip that turned into momentum, on hands that had never turned a wrench learning the bite of a spanner. The women's circle at Clearwater Bend Baptist began as donors and ended as quartermasters. They inventoried linens, boiled bandages, and organized watch schedules for mothers nursing infants who needed the clinic's warmth at midnight. They were not sentimental about it. They ran lists like supply sergeants because suffering hates improvisation. At the shipyard, welders who normally stitched hulls against the Gulf's rough temper took night shifts running bead along bed frames and railings. Joints that would have faced salt spray now faced mop water and bleach. They worked in pairs, one steadying, one guiding, until the metal cooled like held breath. Same job, one welder said, knocking his knuckles on a railing. Different cargo. The high school's science club disassembled an antique switchboard and donated its bones. Wires were sorted by color and length. Backlight knobs were polished back to a dull pride. Eli, the teenage radio tinkerer, mapped a simple call system with a pencil and a faith that electricity prefers tidy paths. Each room earned a button and a numbered light above the nurse's desk. When he flipped the main toggle and the panel winked awake, The room applauded in the shy, unpracticed way of people who rarely clapped for themselves. Not everyone applauded. A seamstress whose husband had vanished with a freighter off the Carolinas spat, the first time she passed a work detail. "They took my man," she said, "and now we let them stitch our wounds." The pastor did not argue. He carried a cot into her parlor 2 weeks later when her sister's baby came early. Under the clinic's new lamp, in a room that did not flicker, the child cried, a thin, outraged sound that announced its intention to live. The seamstress folded a corner of the hospital's first baby blanket and held it to her cheek until the cloth cooled. A field kitchen appeared on weekends. Sawdust. Tables, pies, because work rigs appetite into worry and worry needs starch. The sheriff's deputies poured coffee for guards and prisoners alike. Conversation built muscle slowly. The first jokes were barn quiet, the first laughs accidental. Then someone mentioned football, and a guard used chalk to teach the shape of a down. The game made sense because it was geometry and will. By July, Clearwater Bend was in the odd position of explaining itself to visitors. A county official arrived with a frown and left with a pledge of reclaimed lumber. A Red Cross nurse came suspicious and left measuring shelves for gauze. "You've made a machine," she told Ross, tapping the sterilizer's warm flank. "It runs on need in people. War is a wall of paperwork." Major Greer understood that any bridge across it would be a cantilever of signatures. He drew the load path himself. Camp authorization, county approval, Red Cross oversight, Army liaison sign-off on tool lists, guard rotation memos, daily labor logs with times in, times out, and initials on every borrowed hammer. He did not love the hospital. He loved order, but order, he knew, could be turned toward mercy if the pens didn't run dry. Permits for scavenged equipment proved the tightest choke point. The sterilizer's pressure gauge, for instance, wore a stamped plate that belonged to a mothballed compressor technically assigned to a depot 2 counties north. A depot clerk, vigorous about stamps, sent a denial. The hospital stopped for 2 days, a silence that felt like a held breath. Ross wrote a letter with the precision of a surgical note. Diagnosis, prognosis, remedy. Karl added a diagram with load limits and a margin note about safety. The sheriff drove the letter himself, hat in hand, to the depot office and set it on the clerk's desk with a jar of the church lady's preserved peaches and a signed logbook page showing guard counter signatures. The clerk, a man who respected jars and signatures in equal measure, stamped approval with a grunt. The gauge ticked legal the next morning. Transport was an art of timing. Rail spurs that served the oil loading yard could be borrowed if you knew who to ask and when to ask them. A foreman with a soft spot for the doctor arranged a dusk siding for a crate of surplus glass, misrouted from a warehouse that would not miss it. Glass is heavy with consequence, but the men carried each pane like a promise, slid it into frames, and sealed the edges with putty warmed in palms. Security never relaxed. Work details moved like small convoys. 2 guards, 8 prisoners, a wheelbarrow that squeaked. Tools were chained at day's end. A missing spanner triggered a search that emptied pockets and pried. When Greer discovered a coded snippet tucked beneath a bench, he did not rage. He simply recalibrated. Transfer the agitator inland, tighten the fence line at dusk, increase letter inspections, then restore the work schedule intact. Panic brake systems. Adjustment preserves them. The narrowest gate remained public opinion, so the town learned to narrate its own intent. Notices in the general store window spoke plainly. Hospital project. Work under law and watch. The pastor wrote a column in the county paper about the Geneva Convention, not as virtue, but as contract. "We win," he wrote, "and when we build according to rules that bind us even when no one watches." The line landed. People like contracts. They hate feeling fooled. The project stopped feeling like softness and started reading like compliance. By late August, the hospital had walls that met corners square, floors that did not sag, a water line that sang softly when you put your ear to the pipe, and a lamp that made night negotiable. The town stood inside its skeleton and could already see the beds, hear the quiet choreographies of care. The shell waited for final fittings. The ledgers waited for the last signatures. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the Gulf brewed weather with the slow deliberation of a fact preparing to become an emergency. The storm would arrive with its own paperwork. Sky darkened. Barometer dropped. Fevers rising in the shanties south of the rail line. The machine they had built would need to run at full load before its paint had even dried. The scaffold, at last, would be asked to carry the living. September 2nd, 1943. The air felt heavy enough to cut. Morning began with fever, not thunder. 2 men in the labor camp were carried to the infirmary shivering under blankets. The doctor at Camp Clarion diagnosed heat stroke, but by noon, 5 more collapsed, their skin burning, their eyes glassed with delirium. At the same time, across the tracks in Clearwater Bend, the same symptoms appeared among refinery workers and children in the shanties by the bayou. It wasn't heat. It was something meaner, smaller, invisible. Likely typhus, possibly worse. Dr. Ross received the first patient at dusk, a girl of 8, brought in on her father's shoulders, lips dry, pulse frantic. He had no anti-serum, no antibiotics, not even a reliable diagnosis kit. The hospital was weeks from completion, still a shell of plaster and wiring. But the storm gathering off the Gulf left no time for perfection. At the base, the weather officer's barometer dropped like a stone. Radios buzzed with warnings, a tropical system strengthening into a hurricane bearing straight for the coast. Evacuations were impossible, the trains already full of fuel and military cargo, the roads sinking under rain. The camp commander, Major Greer, stood in his office staring at maps and reports while lightning trembled against the windows. His pen tapped the desk in rhythm with the thunder. He faced an impossible calculus: contain the outbreak inside barbed wire or let the prisoners assist the town in crisis. Both choices reeked of risk. At 8:47 p.m., he called Dr. Ross on the field telephone. The wire crackled. "Doctor," he said, "you'll have no help from the county tonight. Roads are gone. If you can treat your own, you do it now. And if I let these men cross the fence, it's on your conscience, not mine." Ross looked across the clinic, a room thick with heat and fear. The ceiling leaked. The lanterns wavered. He wiped sweat from his brow and gave the only answer that made sense. "Then unlock the gate, Major. I'll take that conscience." By 9:15, the storm made landfall. Rain slammed the tin roofs, rattling nails loose. The wind howled through the warehouse skeleton that would soon be the hospital. Sheets of water moved sideways through the streets. The sheriff organized lanterns and ropes. The pastor herded families into the church basement. And from the direction of Camp Clarion came the impossible sight: a line of POWs in soaked uniforms, carrying crates, generators, and blankets, heads bowed into the wind. At their center walked Karl Heinemann, his jaw set, his cap tied under his chin, a map of the half-built hospital clenched in his fist. Guards followed close, rifles slung but muzzles lowered. They weren't watching prisoners anymore. They were watching for falling debris. Inside the warehouse, chaos ruled. Rain had found seams in the roof. The first power circuit failed with a spark and a hiss. Ross shouted orders, voice swallowed by wind. They hauled the clinic's tables here, laid out tarps, and turned the half-finished structure into a ward. One lantern hung from a rafter, swinging like a slow pendulum of light. "Boiler," Karl called, pointing to the sterilizer. "We need steam, pressure steady, or infection wins." The sheriff blinked. "It ain't even connected, son." Karl grabbed 2 men and the radio boy, Eli. "Then we connect it." They ran pipes by lantern light, bolting joints with hands blistered raw. Ross worked in parallel, bandaging, cutting fevers down with cold cloths, giving orders to townsfolk who had never held a syringe. Every corner of the room carried a task. Water boiling, floors mopped, lightning flashing blue-white through the half-glassed windows. At one point, the ceiling gave a groan that sounded too much like surrender. Karl climbed onto the rafters himself, hammer in teeth, driving boards back into place while the rain stung his face like needles. When he descended, soaked and shaking, Ross pressed a towel into his hands. "If you get yourself killed," he muttered, "I'll have no one left to fix my mistakes." Karl smiled faintly. "Then we both stay alive." By midnight, the hospital was half functional, half miracle. The boiler hissed a thin white breath. The sterilizer whistled and the lamps flickered but held. Greer arrived through the storm to inspect the chaos and froze in the doorway. Men and women, Americans and Germans, all moving as one engine under the same roar of rain. No guards shouting. No hierarchy. Just necessity. He watched Karl testing a pipe joint with bare fingers, Ross pressing a stethoscope to a patient's chest, the pastor carrying towels like a deacon at communion. For a moment, the major removed his cap and whispered something no one heard. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps an apology. Then came the real test. A refinery truck overturned on the South Road. 2 men pinned. 1 child in shock. They brought them in on doors used as stretchers. Blood pooled near the threshold. The lights flickered again, threatening betrayal. Ross barked orders, and Karl answered them without pause, fetching clamps, adjusting valves, holding the lamp steady as the doctor stitched under trembling light. Rain drummed a steady rhythm on the roof. Outside, the town seemed to vanish into darkness. Inside, the world narrowed to breathing, stitching, pulse. By dawn, the storm broke. They emerged to silence. Trees uprooted, streets glittering with broken glass, and the sun limping through clouds like an exhausted witness. Half the town stood on the church steps waiting. When the doctor stepped out, soaked to the elbows, they saw behind him the German pilot leaning on the doorframe. Soot on his face, exhaustion in his posture. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Did they make it?" Ross nodded. All of them. And that was the moment Clearwater. Ben stopped calling him the German pilot. They started calling him the engineer, but history wasn't done testing their creation. The second day after the storm, Clearwater Bend had turned into a mosaic of debris and damp hope. Houses leaned. Trees lay like felled columns across streets. The church roof peeled in half. But the warehouse and their half-born hospital inn still stood scarred but upright. Its walls had held against the wind because its frame was overbuilt, because a German engineer had insisted that storms care nothing for optimism, only for angle and steel. The morning brought no rest. The fever spread faster than the receding floodwater. The hurricane had stirred the cesspools, tainted the wells, and turned every cut and cough into a potential death sentence. The county roads were impassable. Telegraph lines down, phone poles broken. For 3 days, Clearwater Bend existed outside the map of Texas. Unreachable. Unseen on its own. Inside the hospital, exhaustion became currency. Dr. Ross hadn't slept more than an hour at a time since the storm. His hands were red and cracked, his voice raw from calling orders. Karl, equally worn, had started keeping lists on the chalkboard. Supplies, temperatures, repairs. The names blurred. It didn't matter who was patient or who was helper. Everyone worked until they dropped. Then someone else took their place. The fever cases doubled. It wasn't typhus, thank God, but a virulent dysentery carried by polluted water, still deadly, still merciless. The town needed boiled water, constant disinfection, and pressure for sterilization. The boiler was now the heart of Clearwater Bend, pumping heat like blood through its makeshift arteries. But the heart was failing. Late that night, the pressure gauge trembled at 0. A hiss, a drip, then silence. The fuel line had ruptured. No steam meant no sterilization, and no sterilization meant infection would devour everything they had built. Ross stared at the cold metal. Can we fix it? Karl examined the brake, a cracked joint beneath the burner assembly, barely reachable without dismantling half the frame. With new pipe and sealant, yes, which we don't have. Karl hesitated. There is one option, dangerous. The sheriff crossed his arms. You just described everything we've done this week. Karl motioned to the guards. We use aviation sealant. From the base, Greer frowned. That's restricted material. Jet compound. If it ignites wrong, then it burns hot enough to melt the boiler, Karl finished. But if we don't, the town burns slower. Greer studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. Take what you need. I'll sign it in pencil. You'll sign it in blood if it fails. The repair took the night. Karl crawled beneath the boiler, the metal scalding even without flame, his shoulders pressed to the earth. Eli held a lantern close, his hands trembling. Dr. Ross stood by with towels and water, ready to cool whatever caught. When the line sealed and the flame relit, the boiler moaned back to life with a sound that seemed almost human, relief and endurance in one exhale. The pressure gauge climbed, slow but steady, until the needle kissed the mark. The hospital breathed again, but fate wanted one more test. A scream tore through the rain-thick dawn. A woman in labor, carried in from the shanties. Complications. No sterile bed left. No light to spare. The sheriff's wife, pale but determined, stepped forward. We'll make space. Ross prepared the instruments. Karl readied the lamps. Greer, the hardened commander, stood guard at the door to keep curious eyes and fear outside. It was the kind of silence only life and death share. Hours passed, measured in screams, commands, and thunder's fading echo. When the child finally cried, It sounded louder than the storm had. A perfect, defiant wail that made the whole room stop. Ross sat back, shaking, laughing without sound. The mother lived. The baby lived. The lights stayed on. Outside, townsfolk waiting under the dripping awning began to clap. Hesitant at first, then swelling into something raw and collective. Applause for survival. Applause for the living proof that the hospital had already earned its purpose before its doors ever opened. Karl stepped away quietly, wiping his hands on a rag blackened with soot. He looked out through the cracked glass toward the bay, where sunlight was breaking through shredded clouds. The world beyond the fence was wide again, and for the first time since falling from the sky that January night, he realized he was no longer simply waiting for war to end. He was part of something that had. When Major Greer approached, he didn't salute. He simply said, "You've done something remarkable, Lieutenant. Don't make me court-martial you for it," Karl smiled faintly. "If I had disobeyed fewer orders, sir, your town would have drowned." The Major chuckled, then extended his hand. It wasn't the grip of captor and prisoner. It was the handshake of two men who had run out of reasons not to respect each other. That day, when the sun rose fully, it found Clearwater Bend changed, not by victory, not by politics, but by the quiet proof that humanity could survive inside a war meant to destroy it. They named the place St. Matthew's Hospital, though no one remembered who suggested the name. It stood on the very ground where the storm had tested every wall and found none willing to fall. And before the first official patient was admitted, Dr. Ross took a hammer, nailed a wooden sign above the door, and said simply, "Built by the hands of enemies, to heal friends." The town never took it down. When the war ended in May 1945, Clearwater Bend didn't celebrate with fireworks. It had already seen too many explosions. The sirens that had once tested the town's nerves were now used to call nurses off shift. The searchlights were dismantled and repurposed into operating lamps. The hospital, once a skeleton, was now a heartbeat, clean and steady, its walls painted white over the stains of its birth. Dr. Nathaniel Ross never called it his hospital. "It's theirs," he said, meaning the people, the welders, the mothers, the prisoners, and even the sheriff who kept the peace by listening more than speaking. The building had no wings, no wards named for donors, just rooms numbered 1 through 12 and a small plaque by the door that read, "Built 1943-1944, Clearwater Bend Community Hospital." The county officials wanted a more patriotic name, Victory Memorial, Liberty Hall, but the town refused. They knew what victory really looked like: clean linens, steady light, quiet survival. The first months after VE Day brought an uncomfortable quiet to the camp. Orders came to close it. Most of the prisoners were to be repatriated by Christmas. Trucks rolled in with Red Cross translators and endless forms. For many in town, it was a bittersweet day, the war finally ending, yet something irreplaceable leaving with it. The day the trucks came for the German prisoners, the townsfolk gathered along the road. Some waved. Some stood still. No one shouted. There was no triumph in their faces, only a solemn, complex gratitude. In the truck bed, sitting beside crates of ration tins and duffel bags, sat Karl Heinemann, the pilot who'd fallen from the sky 2 years earlier and had somehow become part of a Texas town's bloodstream. Dr. Ross approached as the engines idled. "You'll be sent to New Orleans first," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Then home." Karl smiled faintly. "Home," he repeated, as if testing the word for sharp edges. "Yes, and you will stay." Ross nodded. "Someone has to keep the boiler running." They shook hands. It wasn't firm. Both men were too tired for that, but it was final. When Karl climbed aboard, a hush fell over the crowd. The truck rolled forward slowly, dust rising in its wake, and then he was gone. But he did not vanish entirely. 3 months later, an envelope arrived at the post office addressed simply to Dr. Nathaniel Ross, Clearwater Bend, Texas, USA. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, grainy, showing a man standing beside a newly constructed building with German lettering, Städtisches Kinderkrankenhaus, Hamburg. Beneath it, written in neat, deliberate English, "For the next children. You taught me how to build for them." The doctor framed it and hung it in the hospital hallway. He never told the patients who the man was. He didn't have to. By 1946, the town's reputation had spread across the county. Doctors from Houston and Corpus Christi came to see the Miracle Hospital, built by POW labor. They expected crude work, makeshift walls, temporary wiring. What they found was something far more astonishing: a system that worked. Efficient, logical, and sturdy, designed by necessity, refined by collaboration. German engineering, American heart, one reporter wrote. Though the doctor tore that clipping down the next day. It's just human, he said. Every year the people of Clearwater Bend gathered on the anniversary of the hurricane, not to mourn, but to clean. They washed the hospital floors, repainted the porch, oiled the hinges. It became less a commemoration and more a ritual, a renewal of faith that kindness could be built like masonry, that it could weather anything if everyone held a corner. By 1950, most people had forgotten there was ever a war camp nearby. The fence had been taken down, the land turned to pasture. Children played baseball where watchtowers once stood. But inside the hospital, the memory remained in small, invisible ways. The smoothness of the welded bed frames, the hum of the old sterilizer, the faint accent of its design. And when a new doctor arrived years later, he would sometimes ask, "Who built this place so well?" The townsfolk would smile softly and answer, "Someone who came here by accident, but stayed on purpose." By 1952, St. Matthew's Hospital was no longer a miracle. It was simply there, as permanent as the church steeple or the windmill by the grain elevator. The town had grown around it like ivy, new shops, paved roads, a small school. But every wall, every pipe, every glowing bulb inside that hospital still whispered of its strange, improbable birth. Dr. Ross aged with it. His hair thinned, his gait slowed, yet he never left the building for more than a day. He used to joke that the hospital had claimed him as its final patient, one diagnosis at a time. On quiet nights, he would make rounds alone, running his fingers along the brass gauge of the old boiler as though checking a pulse. It still hissed faithfully, same as the day Karl repaired it under stormlight. German lungs, he'd murmur. Texan heart. The town kept its promise too. Every few years, the citizens pooled funds to add something. A children's ward, a small maternity wing, a tiled hallway. Each addition followed the logic of the first blueprint, still pinned behind glass in the lobby. Lines drawn by a foreign hand, smudged with oil and pencil dust. No one erased them. Then, in 1955, another letter came, this time from Europe, stamped in blue ink, its handwriting instantly recognizable to anyone who had once seen it on repair lists and diagrams. It read, "Dear Dr. Ross, the hospital here stands finished. We have light, warmth, and laughter, not rationed anymore. My daughter was born last winter. She lives because of a design you allowed me to test when the world was falling apart. I hope Clearwater Bend still breathes the same way it did, with discipline, mercy, and purpose. Yours in gratitude, Karl Heinemann." The doctor read the letter aloud at Sunday service. The church fell silent, not from surprise, but from the quiet satisfaction of something circular closing. When he finished, Reverend Miles folded the paper and said, "We prayed for peace. Turns out we built it instead." That year, the town voted unanimously to place a brass plaque beside the hospital door. It did not mention nations, ranks, or wars. Only names and hands dedicated to all who built in the year of storm and fever, Americans, Germans, neighbors. May mercy outlive fear. When Dr. Ross died in 1957, the entire town followed his coffin down the dusty road to the small cemetery by the pines. They buried him beside his wife, beneath a plain stone-marked physician. No grand eulogy, just the sound of the wind against the leaves and the faint hum of the generator still running back at the hospital, the one Karl had wired himself. Decades later, as highways carved through Texas and new towns grew brighter, Clearwater Bend remained modest. But travelers who stopped at the small roadside clinic noticed something unusual. The building was older than its surroundings, yet it felt alive. The nurses still sterilized instruments in a pressure kettle older than their mothers. The light switches clicked with a metallic certainty no modern switch could imitate, and on the lobby wall, framed beside a fading photograph of the storm, hung the picture of a German man standing outside a children's hospital in Hamburg. Beneath it, the brass plaque gleamed, kept polished by generations who never met either builder but somehow understood them. By the time the century turned, few remembered the details, the fever, the hurricane, the camp. History reduced it to a footnote in a county archive. POWs assisted in hospital construction, 1943-44. But in Clearwater Bend, history was not ink on paper. It was the echo of a heartbeat inside brick and pipe. It was the sound of the sterilizer exhaling steam, steady and forgiving. Because mercy, once built, does not crumble. It endures, like the hospital, like the hands that built it, like the light that refused to die in the dark. History rarely records the quiet victories. It catalogs battles, treaties, and the men who drew lines on maps. But it forgets the moments when enemies shared a hammer, or when mercy outlasted hatred. Clearwater Bend never made it into textbooks. It didn't change the course of the war, but it changed the meaning of what war could leave behind. For 2 years, a captured pilot and a weary doctor built something stronger than orders. They built a system that valued efficiency only because it preserved life. That measured strength not in firepower but in endurance. In the middle of a world obsessed with destruction, they proved that construction could be an act of defiance, that building could be braver than bombing. Every war scatters debris, moral, physical, emotional. Most people spend decades cleaning it up, but sometimes among that wreckage, a few souls decide not to rebuild walls but to raise roofs. Clearwater Bend was one such place. It was small, hidden, and almost forgotten. Yet it demonstrated the rarest kind of courage, compassion under constraint. If you stand in that town today, the hospital still hums with quiet purpose. The boiler is gone, the rooms are modern, but the foundation remains the same. And if you listen carefully beneath the murmur of machines and the click of nurses' shoes, you can almost hear the rhythm of its making. Hammer on steel, rain on tin. 2 languages merging into the universal sound of effort. That is the legacy of Clearwater Bend. Not the storm, not the fever, not the uniforms, but the hands that met across a line drawn by nations and decided to build instead of break. Because in the end, the war's loudest noise was silence. And in that silence, a light still burns. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.